that.
Since 2010, only a third of new schools have had sprinkler systems installed, so parents are rightly concerned about the safety for their children. In 2013, the Lacknell House coroner's letter formally recommended the government should encourage providers of housing in high-rise residential buildings to consider retrofitting sprinklers. 2 years later, Inside Housing reported that only 1% of council tower blocks had sprinklers fitting. Can the Prime Minister let us know what the government actually did to encourage the retrofitting during the last 4 years?
The government did indeed ensure that those local authorities were aware of the recommendation that had come from the coroner. They did act on that recommendation from the coroner. But I say to the right honourable gentleman, if we look at what has happened and the identification of the issues in a number of tower blocks so far, there are various issues that lead to concern about fire safety. It is, if we look at what has happened in Camden, for example, where one of the 5 blocks was considered to be habitable, but 4 of the 5 blocks were not considered to be habitable, that was not just because of the cladding, it was because of other issues in relation, for example, to the gas riser. All of these issues raise wider questions. They raise wider questions about the inspections that have taken place. They raise wider questions about residents' complaints, residents' voices not being heard. That's an issue that has been raised at Grenfell Tower. It's also an issue that has been raised in Camden. This is a much wider question. A terrible tragedy took place. People lost their lives who should never have lost their lives. We need to look at what has happened over decades in this country that has led to this position, and that's exactly what we will do.
Mr. Speaker, there have been 2 coroner's reports. Building regulations have not been overhauled, and local authorities, whilst asked to act upon them, have had their budgets cut by 40% during that same period. Under her predecessor, fire safety audits and inspections were cut by a quarter. Fire authority budgets were cut by a quarter. Can the Prime Minister give an assurance to the House that the further 20% cuts to the fire service planned by 2020 will now be halted?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that in his reference to the building regulations, I think he's somewhat missed part of the point in this, which is that it's not just a question of what laws you have, it's how those are being applied. And that is the issue. We have the building regulations about compliant materials. The question is, why is it that despite that, we have seen in local authority area after local authority area materials being put up that appear not to comply with those building regulations? And he talks about... And that is what we need to get to the bottom of. Why is it that fire inspections, that local authority inspections appear to have missed this essential issue?
I think I can help the Prime Minister with this issue. When you cut local authority expenditure by 40%, you end up with fewer building control inspectors.
It's pretty bad when people shout. For somebody to be sitting right by the Speaker's chair and shouting displays, let's say, a lack of wisdom, which should not be repeated. Every member in this chamber must and will be heard however long the session has to run. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, I was simply making the point, which seems to have upset a lot of members opposite, that when you cut local authority budgets by 40%, we all pay a price in public safety. Fewer inspectors, fewer building control inspectors, fewer planning inspectors, we all pay a price. Mr. Speaker, those cuts to the fire service have meant there are 11,000 fewer firefighters. The public sector pay cap is hitting recruitment and retention right across the public sector. What the tragedy of Grenfell Tower has exposed is the disastrous effects of austerity. This disregard for working-class communities, the terrible consequences of deregulation and cutting corners, I urge the Prime Minister to come up with the resources needed to test and remove cladding, retrofit sprinklers, properly fund the fire service and the police, so that all our communities can truly feel safe in their own homes. Mr. Speaker, this disaster must be a wake-up call.
The cladding of tower blocks did not start under this government. It did not start under the previous coalition government. The cladding of tower blocks began under the Blair government. The right honourable gentleman talks about local authority resources and talks about changes to the regulation. In 2005, it was a Labour government that introduced the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, which changed the requirement to inspect a building on fire safety from the local fire authority, which was usually the fire brigade, to a responsible person. The legislation governing fire safety in tower blocks and this was commented on by the Lakanal House report into that fire. It criticised that 2005 order, which had been put in place by the Labour government.
The Prime Minister's answer must be heard, and it will be. Prime Minister.
And laws which took effect in 2006 ended the practice of routine fire service inspections, passing the responsibility to councils. That is why I say to the right honourable gentleman, this should be an issue that across this House we recognise is a matter that has been developing over decades, is a matter that has occurred under governments of both colours, under councils of all political persuasions, and is something which I would hope we would say we should come together and ensure that we get to the answers of why this has happened over many years, what has gone wrong, and how do we stop it from happening in the future.
Order. Understandably, on this most solemn and sensitive of matters, the front bench exchanges have been perhaps inevitably and perhaps rightly very comprehensive. I am now keen that all backbenchers scheduled to take part should have the opportunity to do so. Mr. William Bragg.
Thank you, Mr.